The sun was slipping behind the white domes of Casablanca, casting long shadows over the narrow streets of the French Quarter. Smoke curled from rooftop chimneys, and the smell of coal and cardamom clung to the early evening air. At precisely 6:38 p.m., a man named Edwin Carmichael walked into the Café Moet, a modest establishment nestled near the port, known for its bitter coffee and even darker secrets. I was there with Hercule Poirot, nursing a lukewarm espresso while Poirot carefully aligned his teaspoon with unsettling precision. It had been a quiet week, too quiet for a man like him. He had just begun to complain about the absence of mental nourishment when the front door creaked open. Carmichael's presence shifted the room. His suit was wrinkled from travel, and sweat had soaked the collar of his shirt. But it was his eyes that drew Poirot's attention, darting, scanning, haunted. Not the look of a man in trouble, but of someone already too late to escape it. He approached our table without greeting. His voice was low and urgent. "Monsieur Poirot, I need your help. I believe I'm going to be killed." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And why would someone wish to kill you, monsieur?" Carmichael hesitated. "Because of something I know, something I did. Years ago." Poirot gestured calmly to the empty seat. "Start at the beginning." But Carmichael shook his head. "Not here. I've left something for you. A letter. My room. Hotel Excelsior. Room 237. I opened my mouth to ask more, but he was already backing away. He left a few francs on the table, glanced nervously at a man reading a newspaper near the window, and disappeared into the evening fog. Poirot said nothing for a long time. Then he stood, carefully smoothing his coat. "Come, Hastings. We shall visit room 237. By the time we arrived at the hotel, the receptionist was sweating with anxiety. "Messieurs, there has been an incident." Room 237's door hung ajar. A strange quiet filled the hallway, not peace, but that brittle silence left in death's wake. Carmichael lay across the bed, still fully dressed, his body twisted as though struck mid-motion. Blood had soaked through his white shirt, spreading like ink. His eyes were open, frozen not in horror, but in the terrible recognition of a final truth. Poirot did not speak. He simply stepped forward, scanned the room, and then whispered, "This was not fear, Hastings. This was execution." On the bedside table, the letter was gone. And outside, someone was watching. The following morning, Casablanca stirred beneath a pale sun that offered little warmth and less comfort. Though the city's bustling streets remained unaware of the previous night's events, Hercule Poirot and I had already returned to the Hotel Excelsior, summoned by Inspector Dubois, who arrived with the silent authority of a man too long acquainted with death. Tall, composed, and wearing a neatly pressed uniform, Dubois moved with the careful stillness of someone who measured every step as a statement. The room where Edwin Carmichael had died was already cleared of its body, but the tension lingered like cigarette smoke in the air. I glanced at the faint chalk outlines on the floor and asked, "Suicide?" Dubois shook his head slowly. "You saw him last?" he asked. Poirot, standing beside the writing desk, answered with gravity, "Only hours before. He was shaken, yes, but he was not a man without hope. Certainly not suicidal." Dubois didn't argue. "The autopsy confirms your instinct. The wound is angled low, impossible for self-infliction in a seated position. It was close range, professional, clean." He paused and gestured toward the desk. "There's more. After Carmichael died, someone searched the room. Thoroughly. All drawers emptied. A suitcase slashed open. No signs of forced entry. No note. No weapon." Poirot said nothing, bending instead to examine the rug. With delicate precision, he lifted a small gray thread, military wool, expensive, not the sort worn by common travelers. He held it up to the light. "This was no thief," he said quietly. "This was someone with intent and access." Later that afternoon, our investigation led us to the Café M.O., where Carmichael had spent his final evening. Our first conversation was with Mademoiselle Yet Marot, the dark-eyed singer whose voice could haunt a man long after her songs ended. She greeted us in a narrow dressing room behind stage, her cigarette trembling only slightly as she spoke. "He came to me. Uninvited," she said. Wanted to talk about things I buried years ago. Things that should stay buried. Poirot asked gently. What things, madam? She stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror before answering. The war. My brother. Marcel was part of an operation in Lyon. Resistance. He died in 1940. Carmichael knew why. He wouldn't say it, but he carried it with him, like a shadow. You can always tell when a man has walked through betrayal. Do you believe Carmichael was responsible? I asked. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I don't believe, she whispered. I remember. Next, we met Captain Bernard Lair at a military post near the harbor. His uniform was perfect, his demeanor precise. But beneath it all, I sensed unease. Something held too tightly. Carmichael was unstable, he said plainly. He was digging too deep. Too late. If he'd just left things buried, he might still be alive. Poirot tilted his head. And you, Captain? Have you left your past undisturbed? Lair's gaze didn't falter. It is my job to manage information, monsieur, not to dwell on ghosts. Our final subject proved the most elusive, Baron Klaus von Seckendorf, a man cloaked in mystery and former aristocracy, now living in quiet exile. We found him seated in a small tea-house in the European Quarter, his pale hands folded neatly over a steaming glass of mint tea. Carmichael reached out to me, the Baron said, his voice heavy with weariness. He asked about a particular incident. Desert vaults. Intelligence operations long classified. I was there, but so were many others. Poirot asked, and now? The Baron stared out the window. Now they are dying, monsieur. One by one. Perhaps because we were foolish enough to think the desert forgets. That night, back at our hotel, Poirot stood quietly by the window as the last rays of sunlight faded behind the rooftops. I watched him in silence, knowing better than to interrupt the workings of the little gray cells. Finally, he turned to me. Hastings, he said. 3 people. 1 betrayal. All of them bound by the same scar. But only one of them had the reach and the desperation to silence Carmichael. I nodded, but said nothing. Outside, a black car rolled slowly through the narrow street. On the rooftop across from ours, a figure stood motionless, watching. The air was thick with anticipation. The game, as Poirot once said, had begun. The morning light over Casablanca was filtered through a dull, gray haze, as if the sky itself mourned something long buried. Hercule Poirot and I set out on foot, our destination a forgotten corner of the old Medina, where secrets were often traded for silence and memories came wrapped in spice and smoke. At the center of this winding web of alleys stood a modest antique shop with faded Arabic script over its door. Its proprietor was a man named Ahmed Ben Hassan, known by those in certain intelligence circles as a discreet purveyor of information, valuable if properly priced. He greeted us with wary politeness, ushering us past shelves of old books, broken compasses, and lanterns crusted with dust. Poirot mentioned the name Edwin Carmichael, and the change in the old man's demeanor was immediate. He motioned for us to follow him into a narrow back room lined with cushions and low brass tables. A troubled man, that one, Ben Hassan said, settling himself carefully. Came here often these past weeks, always looking over his shoulder, always asking if someone had been asking about him. Poirot leaned forward. Did he say why? The merchant nodded slowly. He said something from his past had returned to find him, something that should have stayed buried. He paused, his expression darkening. He mentioned a betrayal during the early part of the war, something about a failed operation in France. Many died, he said, because of someone he once trusted. That word again, betrayal. It echoed through the city's air, through every lead we chased, every shadow we examined. We thanked Ben Hassan and returned to the streets, where Poirot walked in silence for some time before speaking. Consider Hastings, he said softly. 3 people connected by war, by secrecy, by regret, but also by something else, something Carmichael feared enough to bring to light before it destroyed him. That evening, our path led us to the Café M.O. once more, this time not as patrons, but as investigators. The proprietor, a rotund Frenchman named Henri Dubois, not related to the inspector, welcomed us cautiously, and led us to a private back room. He spoke freely of Yet Marot. A singer of great beauty, yes, he said, but also great sorrow. She came here alone nearly 2 years ago, from Lyon. Her family? Active in the resistance. All dead now except for her. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And her brother? The man hesitated. Marcel Marot. Part of a resistance network that was captured in 1940. They say someone tipped off the Germans. He was executed. And Carmichael? Poirot asked. He knew, or believed he knew, but she never forgave. We left the cafe as the last light bled into the sea. Our next stop was the military records office, where through quiet inquiries, Poirot uncovered more details about Captain Laire's past. As it turned out, Laire had been the French intelligence officer responsible for coordinating the very resistance operation in Lyon that had failed so disastrously. He had escaped, reportedly by sheer luck, crossing into Switzerland hours before the network was captured. Some called it Providence, said a retired colonel we questioned later at a harborside bar. Others called it convenience. Yet's brother, Laire's escape, Carmichael's growing paranoia, and still the Baron. Our inquiries into Klaus von Seckendorf's history revealed a third thread. He had been in contact with British intelligence during the early war years, feeding them information about Nazi movements. He claimed to have warned the Allies about the infiltration of French networks. His warning came too late for Lyon, but it did prevent further disasters. Yet even here, trust was a currency in short supply. Was the Baron playing both sides? Was he misled or misleading? By the time we returned to our hotel, the day's revelations weighed heavy. Poirot stood at the balcony, gazing down at the flickering lights of the souk far below. Hastings, he said at last. 3 suspects, 3 stories, all plausible, all shaped by loss. But there is something they share, something deeper than motive. What is that? I asked. Fear, he replied, not of being caught, but of being exposed. For what they did, or what they failed to do. And in that moment, I understood. We were not merely chasing a killer. We were navigating a labyrinth of guilt. And the deeper we went, the harder it became to tell justice from vengeance, memory from deception. Casablanca kept her secrets close. But Poirot, I could tell, was drawing closer to the truth. The little gray cells were beginning to arrange the chaos into order. And the storm, I feared, had only just begun. The morning after our exhaustive inquiries brought with it an oppressive silence. The kind of silence one feels rather than hears. Heavy, watchful, almost sentient. Casablanca's skies were muted in slate gray, and the marketplace awoke in slow, reluctant rhythms. Yet for all its noise and bustle, there was a tension in the air, a tightening of strings that only Hercule Poirot seemed able to hear fully. We had barely finished breakfast when Inspector Dubois arrived at our hotel, his hat tucked beneath one arm and his brow furrowed with tightly packed concern. "There has been another development," he said without ceremony. "An attack. Mademoiselle Marot was assaulted in the alley behind her apartment late last night." My breath caught. "Is she? She will recover," Dubois said, raising a hand. "A glancing knife wound, more meant to frighten than to kill. But she insists it was no common thief." Poirot's face had gone very still. "Then the killer grows desperate," he murmured. "And a desperate man, Inspector, is a man close to being unmasked." We visited Yet's apartment just before noon. A small, modestly furnished second-floor dwelling above a tailor shop in the French Quarter. It had clearly been ransacked. Drawers yanked open, wardrobe emptied, letters scattered. But strangely, nothing of value appeared to be taken. "She says the attacker came from behind," Dubois explained as we stepped through the narrow alley where the ambush occurred. "She screamed, and neighbors intervened before he could finish whatever he intended. But she saw enough. A man, well-dressed, wore a fragrance she described as bergamot, not a scent one expects from criminals in the street." It was then that Poirot paused by the rough brick wall at the alley's corner. A protruding nail, rusted but sharp, had caught a fragment of cloth. Poirot plucked it free gently and held it up to the morning light. "Wool," he said softly. "Charcoal gray. Tailored. Expensive. Do you recognize it? I asked. I recognize its owner, he replied, slipping it into an envelope, though not yet by name. That afternoon, Inspector Dubois returned to us with something unexpected. A torn photograph found among Carmichael's personal effects. A group of men in civilian dress, standing before what looked like a railway station, 3 faces partially visible. One, unmistakably Carmichael in younger days. The second, scratched out crudely with pen. The third, a striking resemblance to Captain Lair. Poirot turned it over. Faded pencil scratched the back. Lyon Station, October 1940, before the disaster. The man in the center was removed deliberately. Poirot murmured, "The hand that obscures identity is always the hand that fears it." There was more. A telegram had finally arrived from London, sent to Carmichael's hotel 2 days too late. It read cryptically, "Package delivered. Recipient confirmed identity. Expect developments soonest. W.C." I frowned. Winston Churchill. Poirot shook his head. None. Not the Prime Minister. Perhaps someone sharing those initials. Or perhaps an alias. But more importantly, recipient confirmed identity. A telling phrase. A sign that someone was watching. Or waiting. That evening, as the sun died slowly into the Atlantic, Poirot and I returned to our corner table at the Café Mo. The day's clues lingered between us like the steam from the small pot of mint tea. "Do you still suspect Mademoiselle Marot?" I asked. Poirot sipped, then set his glass down gently. "She has motive, yes," he said. "Her brother's betrayal, her encounter with Carmichael. But her attack last night, it was no attempt on her life. It was a performance. A message. The wound was superficial, meant to cast her as a victim, not to silence her, but to discredit her testimony." "Then who?" "The real killer," Poirot said, "is hiding behind layers. Political, emotional, psychological. Someone with access. Someone watching the investigation from within." He turned to me with a look I knew too well. His little gray cells were close to a conclusion. "Hastings," he said calmly, "I have requested Inspector Dubois arrange a final meeting. One that will include all of our suspects. Tomorrow night. Here. At this very table. The time has come to illuminate the truth. And once it is illuminated, there will be nowhere left to hide." That night, I lay awake listening to the distant sounds of the city. Vendors calling through fog. A dog barking in the unseen dark. The slow shuffle of feet. Somewhere out there, a murderer walked free, believing their secret still safe. But tomorrow, Poirot would speak, and the shadows would have no choice but to answer. The evening descended like a velvet curtain over Casablanca, softening the sharp edges of the white buildings and casting long, trembling shadows across the narrow streets of the European quarter. The Café Mo, with its flickering lanterns and muted hum of conversations in French, Arabic, and English, was unusually quiet. Even the usual din of jazz spilling from the gramophone seemed subdued, as though the very walls were holding their breath. At our usual corner table beneath the rusted ceiling fan, Hercule Poirot sat with his fingers gently steepled, his gaze distant, yet acutely aware of every movement around him. I sat beside him, tense with anticipation. Across from us, Inspector Dubois adjusted his collar, glancing at his notebook, though he hardly needed it tonight. He knew, as I did, that something final was about to unfold. At precisely 7 minutes past 8, the guests arrived. Mademoiselle yet Marot, composed but pale, her shawl drawn tightly across her shoulders. Captain Bernard Lair, stiff in posture, his eyes unreadable but shadowed by fatigue, and an empty chair between them, the one that should have belonged to Baron Klaus von Seckendorf. Poirot waited until the drinks were served, then cleared his throat. His voice was calm, but carried with it a weight that pressed against every wall. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "we are gathered here not by chance, but by consequence. 3 nights ago, Edwin Carmichael sat at this very table. He feared for his life. Hours later, he was dead. Tonight we uncover why, and by whose hand." He allowed a pause to settle, his eyes sweeping the table. The murder of Edwin Carmichael, at first glance, seemed an act of vengeance. A war-scarred man haunted by a betrayal, struck down before his conscience could unburden itself. Our suspects, each of you, had cause. Mademoiselle Moreau, whose brother Marcel was among the resistance fighters executed following the infamous Lion operation. Captain Lair, an intelligence officer whose involvement in that very operation grows more opaque with every retelling. And the Baron, a man whose wartime loyalties shift like desert winds. Yet's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. Captain Lair remained expressionless, his hands folded in his lap with military precision. Poirot continued, gently but with unshakable clarity. Let us begin with the attack on Mademoiselle Moreau. A knife wound, dramatic but non-lethal. The scent of bergamot, remembered. A scrap of expensive wool cloth, left behind. At first, it appeared she had nearly become the second victim. But no. Her life was never truly in danger. The attack was staged, not by her, but by someone hoping to make her appear unreliable. A witness too frightened, too emotionally compromised to be trusted. Inspector Dubois leaned forward, his brows furrowing. Then we have the photograph, Poirot said, lifting it carefully from his coat. Found in Carmichael's belongings. A group of men at Lion Station, October 1940. 3 visible figures, Carmichael himself, a man whose face has been scratched out, and another unmistakably resembling Captain Lair. He turned the photo toward Lair. You were there, Captain. More than just a liaison. More than a contact. You were the architect of the betrayal. Lair's lips parted, but he said nothing. Poirot pressed on. When Carmichael uncovered your treachery, he threatened to expose you. You knew he had written a confession. That night, you used your credentials to gain access to his room. You searched for the letter, failed to find it, and when he resisted, when he tried to prevent you from leaving, you shot him with his own weapon, placing it near his hand to stage a suicide. But the room, I began, was not truly locked. Poirot interrupted softly. The window opened onto a balcony. The chair overturned. A man trained in military escape could easily use the ledge and drainpipe. You escaped unseen. The cloth fragment, torn as you left. The cologne, yours. The wound angle, inconsistent with suicide. Silence hung for a moment like a guillotine blade. Then Lair exhaled slowly. You cannot prove any of this. Poirot's voice did not change. Ah, but I can. Your uniform has been recently repaired. On the left sleeve, yes? Where the fragment tore. And even more damning, you carry the very confession letter in your inner pocket, where your hand strays again and again, as if drawn by guilt. Dubois stood. Captain Lair, he said, voice low and steady. You are under arrest for the murder of Edwin Carmichael and the attempted murder of Mademoiselle Moreau. The captain rose without protest, his face a crumbling mask of pride. You don't understand, he muttered, voice breaking. We thought we could control it. The Germans, they promised protection. I never intended anyone to die. You intended to save yourself, Poirot said coldly. And for that, 23 brave men and women died. As Dubois led him away, the café resumed its slow rhythm. Glasses clinked. A distant saxophone stirred to life. But at our table, none of us moved. Yet Moreau wept silently, her hand pressed to her lips. Tears for her brother, for herself, for what might have been. Poirot reached for his napkin and gently blotted a spot of condensation from the table. The truth, he said, like water, will always find its level. And on that quiet evening in Casablanca, truth had finally risen to the surface. The morning after Captain Lair's arrest, Casablanca awoke beneath a sky bruised with early clouds. The scent of rain drifted faintly through the sea air, and yet the city moved with its usual unhurried rhythm, fruit vendors calling out beneath awnings, trams groaning across worn rails, the harbor cranes bending like steel herons over crates marked with wartime urgency. But within our quiet room at the Hotel Excelsior, the mood was not one of triumph. Poirot stood near the window, his hands behind his back, watching as gulls circled above the port. Justice has been served, I said, uncertainly, though I knew even as I spoke that it was not enough. Poirot turned, his gaze thoughtful but shadowed. Yes, mon ami, justice of a kind. But justice, you see, is rarely a clean affair. It does not erase pain. It merely balances it. In the hours that followed the arrest, Inspector Dubois had worked swiftly. Lair had confessed, though in fragments, his tone that of a man long haunted. The betrayal, he insisted, had begun as a strategic misdirection, a hope to feed the Germans scraps in order to protect larger secrets. But as is often the case with men who believe themselves cleverer than the tide of events, he had been swept away by consequences he could not control. The Germans had wanted proof, and he had delivered the Lion network into their hands. 23 dead. One surviving witness, Edwin Carmichael, had lived long enough to write a confession, and that was a risk Lair could not allow. What he hadn't accounted for, Poirot said, was the desperation of a man burdened by conscience. Carmichael had not tried to publish the letter or mail it to London. He had come, instead, to the one man he thought might believe him, Poirot. And so, Poirot added, his final act was not one of vengeance, but of trust. The confession letter, recovered from Lair's jacket pocket, was now in the hands of Allied intelligence. It contained not only the details of a Lion betrayal, but alarming hints of deeper infiltration into the Allied chain of command. Names unconfirmed, patterns unproven, but enough to shake the confidence of military strategists in Algiers and London. Do you think the others he named are real? I asked. Poirot gave a small nod. Oui. Some may be ghosts. Others may still operate in shadow. But Carmichael, he saw something. The question now is, who else saw it with him? Later that day, we visited Yet Marot at her apartment above the tailor shop. She greeted us with a quiet dignity, though her eyes were rimmed with the red of sleepless nights. The woman who had stood defiant in Café Mo was now softer, as though the burden of vengeance, once carried, had at last been laid down. My brother, she said, her voice catching. He wrote to me once, from a village near Lyon. He said the man he worked with wore medals, but no honor. I never knew what he meant until now. Poirot bowed his head slightly. Mademoiselle, your courage has not gone unnoticed. The path you choose next, know that it is no longer weighed down by silence. She told us she would soon return to France. The resistance was gathering momentum, and she had been asked to aid in communications. Her training as a performer, it seemed, made her an ideal courier, graceful, forgettable in a crowd, and strong enough to survive the weight of coded whispers. I will not be hunted anymore, she said simply. That night, as we dined on the rooftop terrace of the hotel, the wind carried the faint smell of cinnamon and diesel from the Medina. Poirot ate in silence for a time, then spoke, almost absently. You see, Hastings, in war, men commit crimes in the name of cause. They lie to protect the future. They kill to defend memory. And in doing so, they bury themselves beneath the very ideals they sought to preserve. I nodded slowly, recalling Carmichael's pale face on that hotel bed, the letter pressed into the folds of his coat, the desperation in his eyes. Do you believe Lair regrets it? I asked. Poirot lifted his glass, watching the city lights flicker. He regrets the consequence, not the act. And that, mon ami, is what separates remorse from redemption. Beyond us, the sound of the city lulled into night, the clatter of distant hooves, the faint laughter of merchants, and somewhere, the static hum of a military radio crackling secrets into the desert air. Justice had visited Casablanca, but its shadow would linger long after we were gone. The following morning arrived under an overcast sky, the golden Moroccan light dulled by a film of low clouds that cast long, tired shadows over the streets of Casablanca. Yet inside the Hotel Excelsior, the quiet intensity remained. The events of the past week had stirred something deep, not just in us, but in the very soul of the city. And Poirot, ever attuned to such invisible tremors, had risen early. I found him already dressed, sipping strong black coffee by the window, the unopened morning paper folded neatly beside him. Today, Hastings, he said without turning, we speak not to uncover the crime, but to understand the reasons that allowed it to breathe. Before I could inquire further, a knock interrupted us. It was Inspector Dubois, face drawn, mustache slightly less precise than usual. He entered with a manila folder under one arm and worry clouding his expression. The confession letter, he said without preamble, has opened several doors. and not all of them are comfortable ones. He placed the file on the table. Poirot opened it slowly, revealing a list of names. Officials, clerks, low-level operatives, all mentioned by Carmichael as either suspected collaborators or informants. Most had been assumed loyal. One was even based within the Allied command station in Algiers. They're not accusations, Du Bois clarified. Just shadows cast by an uneasy man. But in times like these, shadows are enough. Poirot read the names silently, nodding now and again. You see, mon ami, he said softly. The true legacy of a betrayal is not only the lives it ends, but the trust it poisons. But there was more. Du Bois handed Poirot a telegram. It had arrived that morning from Gibraltar, from none other than Baron von Seckendorf. He is safe, Du Bois explained, and very much alive. He has offered full cooperation with British intelligence. It appears his knowledge of German infiltration may confirm some of what Carmichael feared. Poirot raised an eyebrow. So, the man most suspected may prove to be the one most valuable. Du Bois nodded. He believes a counterintelligence unit within the Abwehr may have been monitoring the resistance through multiple cutouts. Officers who appeared loyal but were strategically placed to disinform. Lair may have been only one of several. The implications were chilling. One betrayal had already claimed lives. But how many more could be lingering beneath the surface, waiting to strike? That afternoon, Poirot and I walked through the old Spanish Quarter, where resistance flyers were now pasted boldly on walls, and Allied flags fluttered from windows that once held their curtains tightly closed. The city, it seemed, had awakened from its long dread, yet remained unsure whether daylight brought relief or revelation. We passed a cafe where yet Marot once performed. It was closed now, its windows dark. Poirot stopped at the door, resting one gloved hand against the frame, as if feeling for something invisible. She has left, he said, but her echo remains. You see, Hastings, the courage of a single soul can shift the balance of a city. Later, back at the hotel, we received a visitor, Major McAllister, a liaison with British intelligence, a man of clipped vowels and cold eyes. He had come to discuss Carmichael's letter. You understand, Mr. Poirot, he said. This cannot become a matter of public record. I understand, Poirot replied calmly. But truth, monsieur, is not always loyal to secrecy. McAllister did not smile. You've caused a great many ripples. We must ensure they don't become waves. After he left, Poirot stood for a long time in silence. Then, finally, he spoke. There are men, he said, who fear truth not because it is a weapon, but because it is a mirror. And mirrors, Hastings, show not only our victories, but also our compromises. That evening, the rain finally came. It fell gently over the Medina, washing the dust from walls and cooling the air. From our window, the city glistened like a dream, fragile and fleeting. Somewhere beyond those rooftops, lives had been changed, some redeemed, others condemned. And yet, the case itself was closed. Captain Lair would face a tribunal, yet would return to the hills of France, where others still waited for answers. The letter Carmichael had written, the secrets it carried, they would be dissected by men in high offices, filed away in steel drawers, marked classified. But Poirot's gaze remained on the street. You see, Hastings, he said finally, truth is never buried. It is only waiting. And Casablanca, she remembers. Rain had stopped by morning, but a heavy silence remained over Casablanca. The Hotel Excelsior, once alive with quiet footsteps and covert conversations, now felt suspended in a moment of stillness. Poirot had kept to his room, seated by the window, reviewing our case with a meticulous calm. Laid out before him were fragments, Carmichael's torn photo, a telegram, a sliver of gray cloth, all evidence of a crime that felt larger than the man who had pulled the trigger. I do not believe it ends with Lair, he said without turning. There is another hand, the one that never fired the gun, but wrote the script. The new telegram came from Algiers, an officer confirming what Carmichael had feared. Allied intelligence had been compromised not by a lone traitor, but by men in positions too high to name. Lair was only a pawn, his betrayal permitted, protected, and quietly buried. Later that day, we returned to the souk. The city was breathing again, but only just. There we saw yet Marot, her mourning veil replaced with a simple scarf. She was no longer hiding. "I leave for Lyon tomorrow," she told us. "They still need voices there. Voices that remember." Poirot smiled softly. "And yours, mademoiselle, will carry far." That evening, Poirot sat motionless. "Do you recall the boy who delivered Carmichael's last telegram?" he asked. "He was not a telegraph runner." We found the boy, a Jewish orphan, paid by a nameless Englishman with a limp. The description matched someone we'd glimpsed once at the British consulate. No name, no rank, only silence. Back at the hotel, a parcel awaited Poirot. Inside, a white chess king and a note. "You won this one, but kings fall too." He passed the piece to me. "Keep it," he said. "It reminds us, justice is not a game, but someone out there still plays." Casablanca had grown quiet, but not clean. Not yet. The following morning arrived veiled in a light haze, as though the city itself had secrets it was reluctant to reveal. The Hotel Excelsior was quieter than usual. Guests spoke in murmurs, staff moved with hushed efficiency, and Poirot, ever the early riser, was already seated in the lobby, examining something on the table before him. As I approached, I noticed there was no coffee, no newspaper, only a single envelope marked with 3 blood-red letters, RXC. Without a word, he passed me the note and sighed. It was short and signed, but heavy with implication. "The game is older than any of us, Monsieur Poirot. Carmichael was never meant to live. He simply remembered too much. The desert doesn't forgive men like him, or like me." Poirot folded the letter with that meticulous care of his, then rose and adjusted his cuffs. "Today, Hastings," he said quietly, "we go to the consulate, but not for diplomacy. One more name has been left unsaid, a name that lives behind polished shoes and polished lies." We arrived at the British consulate under the pretext of arranging our onward travel to Algiers. Behind the administrative pleasantries, Poirot had only one man in mind, Mr. Charles Redgrave, a civilian liaison officer, unassuming, polite, always slightly formal. He walked with a faint limp, wore tailored suits in wartime austerity, and favored bergamot cologne, the very same scent noted at the scene of yet Marot's attack. Redgrave received us in a narrow, sparsely decorated office, the walls lined with outdated maps of France and North Africa. He offered a thin smile, but I noticed something brittle beneath the surface, something that didn't belong to a bureaucrat simply doing his job. Poirot didn't bother with small talk. "You knew Carmichael," he said without preamble. "You knew what he intended to expose. You sent him the final warning, but when he would not remain silent, you turned to Captain Lair to finish what you had started." Redgrave blinked slowly. His eyes narrowed, and he exhaled through his nose, as though trying to suppress both irritation and fear. "Your imagination," he said finally, "is commendable, but I suggest you be cautious, Monsieur Poirot. These are dangerous waters." Poirot reached into his coat pocket and produced the small wooden chess piece Carmichael had left behind. He placed the king gently on the edge of Redgrave's desk. "Carmichael left no surviving copies of his letter," Poirot said, "but I made 3. One was sent to London this morning. The second is en route to Algiers, and the third rests quietly beneath the Moroccan sun in the event that anything should happen to me or my associate." Redgrave was very still. Then, slowly, he stood and straightened his cuffs with military precision. "You've made your choice," he said flatly, "and now the game will unfold, Monsieur Poirot. God help the rest of us." We walked out of the consulate without further words. The air had grown hotter, the wind coarser. A gust carried dust across the boulevard, stinging the eyes. Back at the hotel, Poirot sat by the open window in silence for a long while, watching the horizon blur into the heat. "Hastings," he said at last, "we solved the murder, but the machinery that powered it, it still turns. Somewhere, another Carmichael is being silenced. Somewhere, another truth prepares to be buried." I asked him if he regretted anything. He held up the chess king in his hand, turned it thoughtfully, and murmured, only that men like Redgrave play games while others bleed. Outside, the sun was slipping lower over the Atlantic. The desert wind returned, coiling through the alleyways of Casablanca, and behind the high walls of the consulate, the gray room, where power dressed in silence, closed its door once more. The next morning dawned pale and windless, the first stillness Casablanca had known in days. Our plane to London stood ready at the airfield, its silver wings glinting faintly beneath the cloudless sky. The desert winds, once restless with secrets, had finally fallen silent, though Poirot, seated beside me in the departure lounge, seemed lost in a world of quiet reflection. The events of the past week had left their mark, not just in the journals I'd filled each night, but in the careful lines of thought drawn across Poirot's brow. Captain Laire's arrest had shaken the local authorities, but his confession had gone even further. With remarkable clarity, and a desperation that bordered on release, he had laid bare his choices, his compromises, and the slow, deliberate path that had led him from patriot to traitor. His betrayal had not been one of ideology, but of fear and pride, woven together until they had become indistinguishable. He had tried, he claimed, to control the flow of information to both sides, feeding scraps to the Germans in exchange for promises of safety and clemency. But in doing so, he had condemned dozens, perhaps more, to death, including those who had once trusted him without hesitation. Poirot had remained silent through most of the confession, his gaze fixed on the tiled floor, his hands folded neatly on the table before him. Only once, when Laire finally broke down and admitted to watching Carmichael die, silent, pleading, betrayed, did Poirot rise and walk out, saying only, "There's no cleverness in cowardice." As we boarded the aircraft, I noticed yet Morrow standing by the perimeter fence. She raised a gloved hand in farewell, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses, her posture proud despite all she had endured. Poirot inclined his head toward her. "She is stronger than even she knows," he said softly. "Some wounds make us weaker, others make us unbreakable." Yet would return to France within the week, having been summoned by the resistance leadership. News of Laire's exposure had traveled quickly through clandestine channels, and she was now seen not just as a singer, but as a symbol of quiet endurance. The voice that once sang for the lost would now speak for the living. As the plane lifted into the sky, Casablanca shrank below us, white domes and ochre alleys fading into the sunburnt landscape, where secrets had been buried beneath sand and shadow. Poirot stared out the window in silence, then turned to me, his voice low but certain. "Hastings, do you recall what I said when we first arrived? That the desert remembers?" I nodded. "Then you see, mon ami," he continued, "this was never merely about a letter, or even a murder. It was about memory, about truth, and the lengths to which men will go to hide both." I asked him if he believed justice had been done. "In part," he replied. "The guilty have been exposed, and the innocent protected. But the war continues, and as long as men fight in shadow, there will always be truths that bleed in silence." I sat back, watching the Moroccan coast vanish behind us, and I thought of all we had witnessed: the locked rooms, the coded messages, the midnight bells, the betrayed hearts. And I knew he was right. This had not been a tale of one man's death, but of many lives entangled by a single moment of fear, long buried and only now brought to light. As we flew toward London and the uncertain future that awaited us there, I wrote the final words of our investigation into my notebook. In the city of shifting sands, the truth, like the wind, cannot be caged, and when it rises, it does not ask for permission. Beside me, Hercule Poirot closed his eyes, and at last the wind, though distant, began to stir again.